Now, it's with enormous pleasure that I introduce Brian Stein. Brian Stein had a high-profile, high-pressured position as CEO of a major company in the corporate world until he became electrosensitive due to prolonged use of his mobile phone. He knows firsthand the impact that EHS has on both business and family life, and as chairman of the EM Radiation Research Trust, seeks to inform, inspire, and spread the word, as well as promoting the need for solid, independent science to prove the case. I've worked with Brian for nearly a decade, and he's been chairman of the Radiation Research Trust for a little longer than that. And I want to thank him personally for his incredibly hard work and for everything he's given on a personal as well as professional level.
Thank you, Erica. I became electrically sensitive in the year 2000, or I realised what had happened to me in the years 2000. And I became known within the community of being electrically sensitive, and I was badgered for 4 years to go out in the press and talk about it. And I hid away for 4 years because this is quite threatening, and it's quite threatening when you're chief exec of a £750 million turnover company whose major relationships is with the major retailers. And when you're producing own-label food, it's all about your credibility. But after a number of experiences, decided that I could no longer sit by and not start talking about this, because I saw more and more evidence of why this was happening, and I saw more and more evidence from the scientists to show that this was only the tip of the iceberg. So I went out, the first person in the UK in a major newspaper, declaring I was electrically sensitive, and I had every newspaper and every radio station and TV station in the UK wanting to pay me a visit the following day. And I made myself available for 1 week. After 1 week I'd had enough and decided no more. And when I made a number of TV and radio interviews, the first radio interview I made, Jill Meara from the Health Protection Agency came on after me and said, this is ridiculous, this doesn't exist, it's phony. I continued to speak about the issue, and the second interview I made on the radio, Jill Meara said that, well, we need to make some studies to see whether this exists. And after my third interview that week on the radio, Jill Meara said, we need to help these people who are electrically sensitive. So I thought I'd done my job and I could sit back for a little while I thought that they were starting to take this seriously. And they did. They took it very seriously. They plotted and planned as to how they could ridicule people who had become electrically sensitive, because they recognised that the research that was going on and the experiences of electrically sensitive people did fit like a hand in a glove. And how could they stand up and say EMFs are safe if people are becoming electrically sensitive? It's a proof positive that it's not safe. But increasingly, as the research came out, most of the people that were electrically sensitive could actually see the things that were happening to them were happening in the research. And although those things in the research will take years to come about, how long we wait and see, it was happening in electrically sensitive people after an hour, after 2 hours, after a day, or a few days. The reason that I know that these people are either incompetent or corrupt, you'll find on this particular website where I talk about my electrical sensitivity. And I don't particularly want to do that now, because I think I've got more important things to talk about. But having gone on the radio and TV, I was then interviewed by Sir William Stewart, the head of the Health Protection Agency, who's the one individual at the HPA that actually was starting to take this seriously. And he was a good guy in the HPA, and sadly he's no longer there. Just very briefly, when I took part in it, I had to pull out. I suffered with internal bleeding, I suffered with heart palpitations, I suffered with memory loss, and these things lasted for 5, 6, 7, or 8 days, and there was no way that I could go into the shielded room again to take part in that study. And I pulled out, and they told me that they'd take my results seriously, even if I pulled out, and when I got my results later, they ignored me because I didn't finish the studies. But interestingly enough, Alistair Phillips, who's been mentioned previously, did an analysis of the actual data that Essex University produced. And you can see on this side, this is the first column is the sham, and the second two are the two signals. And you can see on the right-hand side here, this is the control group of people who were not electrically sensitive. And you can see that there's very little difference between them, and people couldn't recognise whether the mast was on or the mast was off at all. But the group who were electrically sensitive, and they said that it made no difference, that they were wrong, they got it wrong all the time. You can see the first is the sham, and then the other two is the different signals. And you can see that it's not as simple as they made out. They published there was no difference. And when you get behind the actual details, a little bit like has been presented earlier, you find that the truth is slightly different. There was evidence that people were electrically sensitive, and the most severe people, like me, had to pull out. Michael Bevington, who's the chair of ASUK, and I think is in the audience somewhere, has published a document where there's hundreds of studies showing how and why people, animals, plants are electrically sensitive. In my early days, I was interviewed on the World Service with Per Surgebeck, a technician from Ericsson. He helped develop the mobile phone, and he became electrically sensitive. And 50 of the people that he worked with developing the mobile phone became electrically sensitive, some of them mildly, some of them severely. And what Ericsson did, because these people were very important technicians and they needed them to work, they shielded their homes, they shielded their car, they shielded their work environment so these people could carry on working, knowing that they were electrically sensitive. And then the mobile phone industry started to take off. It became rather important. And what then happened was that the mobile phone industry started to be controlled, not by scientists, but more by politicians and marketeers and lawyers. And they realized that they were helping these people with electrical sensitivity that had been harmed by what they were putting on the market. And all those 50 people were sacked. So this idea that electrically sensitive people are imagining it and they're frightened of technology is nonsense. Because these people were not frightened of the technology, and the people that I'm talking to each week who become electrically sensitive, the reason they're becoming electrically sensitive is because they've embraced this technology and they're becoming electrically sensitive because of it. Our conference took place 11 years ago, and the thing that stood out for me at that conference, apart from the evidence that was presented of harm, was two things. One, the Russians presented their evidence, and then ICNEB were challenged as to why this evidence has not been taken into account. And Mike Charlie coughed and said that, well, it was printed in Russian. And all the science that was used to evaluate the problems had to be printed in English, and the scientific studies from Russia were in Russian. More recently, the head of the body in Russia, we had at a conference 2 years ago, and he is on our website talking about it, he offered the World Health Organization the 20 most important Russian studies in Russian that they would get them translated for the World Health Organization. And he says, on film, they didn't want them. The other thing that fascinated me was there was many scientists that actually demanded to know from Mike Repercoli why their papers were being ignored in him saying that there was no evidence or no repeatable evidence or no reliable evidence of harm. And it got quite heated. And Mike Repercoli actually said that the reason for that was they reviewed all the science by reliability. Now, if you think about that, the people who are part of ICNIRP has been described are all people that deny that this is possible. So how do they determine which science is reliable and which science is not reliable? It's quite simple. Those science that says there's a problem has got to be unreliable. And the science that shows that there's no problem is that they give weighting to because of its reliability. And that's why they come up with there's no reliable evidence of harm. I liken it to, it's a little bit like the Catholic Church in the 17th century when they said that the earth was the centre of the universe, and any research that came along and said it wasn't. Well, they had hundreds and hundreds of years of research saying that the earth was the centre of the universe, so they've no need to look at this new research that was coming out that was actually saying, no, it wasn't. The earth is actually a minor little planet in this cosmos. And the Premier of Norway, who became the head of the World Health Organization, Gro Harlem, became electrically sensitive. And she talks about her electrically sensitive. There's somebody that's not frightened of technology. But sadly, Gro did not remain head of the World Health Organization for long. It was probably a little bit of an embarrassment for them. And what you find with the members of ICNIRP, as has been described, is that those people that are invited to become part of ICNIRP are the scientists that in their own countries are shouting that there's no problem. There's no reliable evidence that there's a problem. And it's only those individuals that say these things that are then invited to sit on ICNIRP. So surprise, surprise, the people who sit on ICNIRP say there's no problem. Oleg Grigoriev, who's the head of the Radiation Protection Board, non-ionizing Radiation Protection Board in Russia, presented at a small conference that we had. And basically, what he was saying is that electromagnetic fields cause cancer. It's directly causing damage to the nervous system and indirectly causing cancer. And that they have 100 years research showing that EMFs cause cancer. And in Russia, the scientists that work in this area are highly esteemed and valued scientists, opposed to the scientists that work in this area on the West are ridiculed because they came up with the same results. But likewise, we see in some of the research in Germany and in America, the same thing. Many, many years ago, they were finding that exactly the same results that are being found today. And this was military research, and all the people that did the research were basically had their funds taken off them and stopped or prevented or encouraged not to continue their research. And what you find is that the Bi-Initiative report, for those that people want to see all the research that is available, has been published. It's a massive document, and it has been around for over 10 years, more than 10 years, probably more like 14, 15 years, and they list all the evidence, and it's there for you to see. Now, having been to other talks and talked about the evidence, what I have been ridiculed about is that this report is unscientific. This report is not peer-reviewed. This science is not peer-reviewed. And I've had physicists say that to me, and obviously it's nonsense. All the science in this report is peer-reviewed. But what the HLPA are saying is it's not peer-reviewed, and what they mean by that is that the chapters that were in the book had not been peer-reviewed. Not that the science hadn't been peer-reviewed, but the total chapter hadn't been peer-reviewed. That's now been corrected, it has been peer-reviewed. But what you can see happens is these people are not interested in looking at it themselves, because this guy who argued with me, he said he'd looked at some of the science, and it was obviously junk science. And what he'd actually done is been on the website of PHE and seen that it wasn't peer-reviewed, he thought, and that's what he was spouting. And that's what happens. People take little bits of the argument from ICNIRB and pronounce that all the science is rubbish. If you look at the reflex work that was done many years ago, showing DNA breaks, the same between non-ionizing radiation and ionizing radiation. So, although that this was impossible, what the research was showing at 7 universities across Europe, that the results were basically the same. And what the Russians would say is, yeah, the results are the same. It's just a matter of time. It takes longer. But the DNA is being damaged by non-ionizing radiation. And when this was published, what happened was that the rector of the Medical University of Vienna withdrew the reflex research from Vienna because a medical laboratory technician had confessed to fabricating the data. So the headlines in the papers across Europe were reflex project data. It was not verified. It was fraudulent. That was the headlines. And it just so happens that the lady who was being told and had told the newspapers that she'd admitted to this was ringing up her friends and emailing her colleagues and saying, this is a lie, I have not admitted to fraud, this is a setup, till eventually the university was embarrassed sufficiently to have to do an investigation, and at the end of the investigation she was reinstated with full honours, and the person who made the accusation from the university that had come from the mobile phone industry left the department. But not all countries are quite as adamant. In this publication that is dated 2005, it says on the first page, it has been scientifically established that intensive non-ionizing radiation is harmful to our health, but certain biological effects also occur at exposure levels well below internationally recommended limits. Since scientists cannot at present indicate how harmful these effects are, it is advisable to take certain precautions. And the whole booklet is about the precautions that the government can take and you as individuals take. So not all countries are quite as adamant that there is no biological effects that can harm you. And in reality, now half the population of the world is protected at a greater level than we are in the UK. So China, India, Russia, part of Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, Italy, all those countries have levels that are significantly below the guidelines because they've started to recognise that the ICNIRB guidelines are rubbish. And Sir William Stewart, who wrote his report, he came to our conference, and this was a number of years after his 2000 report, and he said, when he introduced the conference, that he was much more concerned now than he had been in 2000 that there was a problem. And shortly after that, Sir William Stewart went on Panorama, where he said that we should not be installing Wi-Fi in schools. There's too much research there to show that there might be a problem. And sadly, I repeat, although I think a good guy, for whatever reason, departed as head of the Health Protection Agency shortly after that. But what, to my amazement, because when I became electrically sensitive, I'd looked at the Health Protection Agency advice and everything was okay, it shouldn't be a problem, and I believed them. But at the time, the same time, this was in 2000, the T-Mobile report was leaked to the press. The T-Mobile report, this report, was conducted by T-Mobile and kept under wraps. It showed genetic damage, DNA strand damage, damage to ion channel communications, tumour promotion, damage to blood-brain barrier, sleep damage, slow brain potential, impaired cognitive function, stress hormones, cancer, leukemia, infertility, damage to the immune system, damage to the central nervous system. And that report was not issued. And the reason it wasn't issued, you can imagine. But the press, one of their workers leaked this to the press, and that was then resulted in the press confronting T-Mobile and asking them the questions, well, hang on, have you not taken this seriously? And what then happened was that T-Mobile said, oh no, we took this really seriously. We took it so seriously that we went to a different university and asked them to conduct a report as well, and that report said everything was okay. And that's how it works. Read that. You know, people won't insure this industry for damage that they're doing to us. Now, the insurance industry are not stupid. If they thought that non-ionizing radiation couldn't damage you, they could make a fortune. And they won't insure because they know that there's a problem. And an individual in Austria that did some research a number of years ago, quite a while ago, and there had been a hotspot in Austria of cancers and quite a lot of publicity about it, as a result of which the mast was removed. But the local health authority decided to do work on it, and the work that they did, they showed that where the cancers were was actually where the hotspots from the mast were. They were able to replicate what had gone on, the areas where everything was okay and the areas where there was hotspots, and they could actually correlate between the two, and they published that report. And what the industry did, the people who owned the mast, is they attempted to sue the individual that had written the report. Fine, the individual was quite happy with that, until they said that they were going to sue him personally, which was quite threatening. And then they revealed their defence. What they said was that mast had never, ever been turned on. So the local authority asked them for proof of this. They wanted to see the documentation to show that the mast had never been turned on, and they'd lost it. It had all been thrown away. And that individual ended up having to write a retraction and say that the mast had never been turned on because he was being threatened with suit, and it would have cost him millions of pounds. Millions of pounds. So we've now got a whole host of work going on with mobile phones and finding that they're exceeding the legal limits, and after the research that was done in France, they're now being done in other countries, and they're finding the same thing. They're finding that mobile phones to your head can actually exceed the legal limits. So the question you need to ask is, well, hang on a second, if this is being treated seriously, how are these phones being put on the market? How are they being tested, and how are they being set onto the market without being tested correctly? The NTP study showed that there was convincing evidence of tumours of the heart and the brain. How was it reported in the UK? It was reported, mobile phones do not cause tumours. It was the only paper that reported it. No other paper even reported the NTP study, but the Times did, and that was the headline. So the RRT complained to the Press Complaints Commission about that headline, and the Press Complaints Committee ruled in favour of the Times because they said, the FDA says that this doesn't necessarily mean harm to humans, and Cancer Research UK said highly unlikely. But it was quite ironic, I think, that on the same page. So we're now seeing court cases in Italy where masts are causing issues, and the Supreme Court in Italy ruled that the mast had caused the hotspots around the Vatican. Sadly, they haven't had compensation because the Vatican has pleaded that there's no danger and they have God on their side. So the poor people that have had cancer have had no compensation. And likewise, we've had people in Italy winning court cases for brain tumours. And I believe also there's been a number of other cases since then where they have shown that they've, on a balance of evidence, they've shown that they've caused brain tumours. So the RRT, a number of years back, decided that we would go out with a publicity campaign, and we looked at all the research, and the one that we thought we would take was fertility, because 80% of the research shows fertility was being damaged, male fertility was being damaged. So we thought we're on reasonably safe grounds with that, because cancer at that stage was 50-50, so we thought we'll go with something that's 80-20. And a number of people objected to this campaign, and we were demanded by the Advertising Standards Authority to take our posters down and to prove what we were saying. So we got all the papers and we sent them to the Advertising Standards Authority, and 80% of them showed there was damage, and they ruled against us. And the reason they ruled against us was that in Britain, that research is not generally accepted. So we ran another campaign, and all we did was simply said, in the 1950s, the Department of Health said there's no evidence cigarettes damage your health. In the 1960s, the Department of Health said there's no evidence asbestos damages your health. In 2016, the Department of Health says there's no convincing evidence radiation from mobile phones. They had nothing to complain about. We were spreading the gospel. But why is this concerning? This is what they want to do. And sadly, this debate is no longer about science. If it was about the science, we would have won the debate. This debate now is about the spin. And these industries have millions, if not billions of pounds to spend. And they're doing it. So, clean air? What do they mean by clean air? Full of radiation. And you know, as you read the papers and you've seen this research, you can then associate with the headlines that are going on, with why it's going on. So there's no accidents, I think, that what we're seeing is cancer rates around the world are rocketing, senile dementia rates around the world are rocketing, fertility is declining. These are no coincidences, and depending on the country you're in, will depend on the reason why it's been blamed. And the truth is, they will use any other excuse other than masts and mobile phones for the ills of the world. And what's the one thing that has changed dramatically in the last 20 years that they don't want to look at? In 2008, I predicted that cancer rates would rocket, senile dementia rates would rocket, fertility would decline, and, bearing in mind I was chief executive, we had a final salary pension scheme, and I maintained that final salary pension scheme for all my staff. And the reason I did that was because one day it's going to go into reverse. And the actuaries that looked after our pension scheme laughed at me. and said, that's not possible. You know, people born today, they'll live to be 150. And what is happening now in America and in the UK? Longevity is now going into reverse. And I noticed on the radio 3 days ago that the number of people living to 100 is actually going into decline in the UK as well. So all I would say is that although the research might be alarmist, it's accurate. And you only have to see the conflict of interest from the different organisations. I mean, this is full. Every other page is a wireless advert. Over 50% of all media expenditure in the UK now comes from the wireless industry. So which newspaper is going to stand up and claim that it damages? Because they lose their advertising revenue. The government make tens of billions of pounds by selling the licenses for 3G, 4G, 5G. So they're compromised as well. And Cancer Research UK, who keep coming out saying there's no evidence, Cancer Research's UK head office was supported and built by Hutchinson Peruna, the mobile phone operators. So you see, there's an epidemic there of people who have massive vested interests to tell you lies. Thank you.
I just want to point out that Brian Stein's a very humble man, and he wrote this and didn't put on there that it just so happens that after an unusually prestigious history in the business world, he also got a sneaky law degree, an MBA master's, and he has a CBE, which is, I'm glad to say, some official recognition of his altruism.